This is Going Underground. I'm Afghan. Every Monday, Wednesday and Saturday we're bringing you the stories that really matter in the United Kingdom for those of you wishing to question more. Coming up in the show, Britain has been catastrophically defeated in Afghanistan, with British troops cutting and running from Helmand this week, still under attack from the Taliban. We speak to Afghan veteran Joe Glenton about the failed 13-year campaign. And the Defence Secretary may have apologised for saying that British towns are under siege from immigrants, but how well are we doing when it comes to xenophobia and racism? Plus, what will our Prime Minister be saying to the Emir of Qatar behind the closed doors of Number 10 today? All this and more coming up on today's Going Underground. In the past few days, Britain decided to leave 500 troops in Kabul as the Union flag was lowered in Camp Bastion in southern Afghanistan. The hundreds of troops cut and run as news came of an imminent Taliban attack. Britain's 13-year, £20 billion campaign killed and wounded thousands and thousands of UK soldiers and tens of thousands of Afghan civilians, though no one was counting them. Just after Christmas 2013, Prince Harry paid a visit to Camp Bastion. It was just months before it became known as Britain's Guantanamo Bay. While Prince Harry toured the base in a Father Christmas hat, scores of Afghan prisoners had been held in secret for months on end with no access to legal representation. After Prince Harry's visit, documents were leaked to the BBC, which prompted the Ministry of Defence to announce it would finally release some detainees. But the legacy of our defeat in Afghanistan will be felt not only there and amongst bereaved British military families. Before British troops went into Afghanistan, the Taliban, together with the United Nations, carried out one of the world's greatest anti-drug campaigns in history. Poppy cultivation was all but wiped out. But after British intervention, Afghanistan is now the greatest illicit opium producer in the world. Within days of Britain's withdrawal, new figures from the UN had showed that Afghan opium production is now at an all-time high. Given that latest figures show that opiate use on the streets of Britain, that's heroin and methadone, has gone up a third since the troops went into Afghanistan, we can only ask, who benefited from our war in Afghanistan? Just warlords, military contractors, and heroin dealers? And why are taxpayers still funding 500 troops in Kabul instead of veterans here with PTSD? We'll speak to British veteran of Afghanistan, Joe Glenton, later in the show. Today, MPs from the Public Accounts Select Committee published their report on reforming UK border controls. But what if every town and city in Britain decided to break free, create its own borders, take charge of their own futures and their finances? Joining me in the studio is Ben Rogers, founding director of the Centre for London think tank and author of the new report, The Brightest Star, a manifesto for London. Welcome, Ben, to Going Underground. So, Cameron Clegg Miliband, you say in this report they haven't made any significant speech about London since they took office. Why do you think that is?
I don't know, I've been embarrassed about it. London's not popular through much of the country. It's associated with a centre of government, which isn't popular. It's associated with banking and financial services, which aren't popular. It's associated with perhaps migration, not always very popular. So they're all quite keen to be seen to be not too closely associated with London. But in my view, it's a huge mistake insofar as London needs a lot of political attention. 1 in 8 voters live in London. And it's in many ways the UK's greatest asset. I mean, it's probably the world's leading city, an urban superpower, and it's gone in the last 10 years from strength to strength. I mean, everybody wants a bit of a London action, whether you're a rich oligarch looking to buy a flat in Belgravia, or whether you're a low-skilled migrant looking for a job, or you're a tourist, you want to come to London. It's wonderful in lots of ways, brings in lots of money, but the real point for London, and the reason I wanted to write this report, was actually it's in danger of falling victim to its own success.
You see, perhaps their embarrassment and their advisors would be telling them, don't mention London because the rest of the country is paying for all the losses made by London. London is a net, debtor to the inner city streets of Glasgow, Manchester and Liverpool.
Well, over the longer term, that's certainly not the case, but I think it's a fair point.
This is the Elizabethan age.
Well,
but I mean,
we're
talking hundreds of millions, hundreds of billions of pounds to subsidise the losses of the City of London.
Well, indeed, but is that London, or is it some
the city?
Some banks, many of them American-owned, of course, and American-run.
But it's London that we're paying for, isn't it? I mean, if London was devolved the way that you want it to be, and we had regulation, are you saying therefore we could have regulated these banks and said to them no? and they wouldn't have made the losses.
Well, I don't think even a London government would want to regulate banks differently from the rest.
Everyone wants to regulate them differently.
From the rest of the UK.
Hundreds of billions of pounds to the rest of the country.
Well, I mean, I'm not quarrelling with that. I mean, what I'm saying is that London can't meet its present challenges and can't help the rest of the UK grow unless we devolve much more power from central government to London government. The fact is that the UK is and remains, by OECD standards, an extraordinarily centralised country, a complete outlier. 75% of spending in London comes from government grant. In New York, it's about 35%. In Tokyo, it's 7%. So what's happening is that central government is imposing sort of tax policies and regulation.
They're already getting the money back because London cost so much money. You were at the IPPR, a very influential think tank, up until the Lehman collapse. Do you think that that's influencing the way you're looking at it? Because if you're someone in the rest of the country, you're bound to be going, well, yeah, let London go alone and let London pay for all the losses made there.
Well, I'm certainly not. I don't want to see London clawing back more of its earnings than it already does. My point is...
It doesn't earn anything, does it, because of the losses made in the city?
Well, the tourism is huge. I mean, inward investment is huge. I mean, it is currently a net contributor. Spearing another financial disaster will remain so. The point is, though, is that if London grows, that's good for the rest of the country.
Let me just get onto the democratic element of democratic control. I mean, would you be advocating more democratic control over the City of London? It seems not.
I would be...
Because the City of London is separate, isn't it? It's very complicated. I'm not even sure I understand how they elect their own people to run their own police force and so forth.
It is very complicated. I think the key institution that needs more power is the mayor. The mayor's 15 years old, will be next year. It's been a great success. A bit of power has been devolved first to Ken and then to Boris over the years, but I just think there's a lot more that needs to come down.
You mentioned Tony Blair's success during the years when it came to policies like education and healthcare. When you say the NHS property portfolio is 3 times the size of Hyde Park, you don't mean that a Democratic mayor might just flog it all off?
Well, I don't flog it all off or make it available, to make the bits of it that aren't needed available to, say, affordable housing.
But surely the National Health Service should decide that, hence the N in NHS.
Well, the National Health Service has a very bad record, I'm afraid, at using its estate very effectively. It holds on to it. I
thought it's the most economically efficient health service in the world.
Well, I think if you're looking at I suspect that those calculations don't take into account the use of its estate. I mean, what the mayor has shown, I think, is that, and this is true of both Ken and Boris, is that they are very good at getting things done, whether it's congestion charge or the Olympics. They will get things done. But we want more. We want more of that. I mean, we're not asking for anything more radical than is found in most other comparable cities. I mean, in fact, the proposals that we're suggesting, which is that central government devolves property tax to London. London would still be getting only 15% of the overall tax take from the city. We think that would work to grow London and therefore to grow the UK economy.
So how do you mean? But would London be? I mean, the big elephant in the room here is the City of London, right? That's what makes the city run, presumably.
It's not. No, I mean, London is much more than its financial services. It's much more than its
tourism and so on.
Creative industries, increasingly higher education. You've got tech city.
But everyone's talking about the deficit when it comes to macropolitics, and it's London's impact on that. I hate to keep going back to that. I mean, it's flattened any contribution, certainly it's made in the past 10 years, 15 years?
I'm just not... I accept all of that. I'm just not sure what the relevance of it is. I mean, I'm talking about devolving principally tax-raising powers to London.
So could we have a Tobin tax? Could we have a tax on the City of London? I mean, if London has had a tax on the City of London, London really would be the richest city in the world, wouldn't it?
I think the right tax is to devolve property taxes because, first of all, they're very hard to... You don't get gaming with property taxes. If you devolve lots of other taxes, then people register their company or their personal home as being somewhere else, and then they pay lower taxes in London. Property tax is the right one to do. Most other cities, it's the mayor who has control over property taxes, and then you can get rid of our hugely dysfunctional, regressive and out-of-date system of property taxation. Instead, we've got Labour saying, well, they're going to introduce a mansion tax, which is essentially just a tax for London. Why not give the mayor the power to decide the right tax for London? I think actually you get a more progressive tax, the mansion tax.
Now, you do mention this Arab's report saying that, commissioned by the GLA, that 1 trillion in investment is needed in the next 35 years. Given that the things that you want to happen may not happen, won't it be foreign investment that creates that 1 trillion? In effect, Qatar and countries like that just buying up infrastructure and investing in infrastructure.
Well, they've got a huge role to play. I don't think they can do it all by themselves. I mean, I think you actually need some sort of subsidy in things like affordable housing, which is probably going to have to come from the state.
And you don't have any truck with the idea that somehow it pulls resources away from the rest of the country, and whether if there was more devolution, it would also hinder the growth of other neighbouring cities.
I want to see devolution to other cities in the UK as well, and I make that absolutely clear. But I do find it puzzling. There's so much talk about devolving power to cities of the north, to Scotland, and very little talk about devolving further power to London.
You credit the Labour governments for their academies programme in education. Surely if it was more democratically devolved, we would have ended up with more quasi-privatisation of schools in London.
We've had Ken and Boris. I mean, neither of them have been huge privateers. Ken fought
because
very
they haven't been allowed to, presumably, is what you're making out in the report.
Probably London is slightly left, well, it's hard to measure these things, probably in some ways slightly left of most of the country. I mean, Boris is perhaps a bit unusual. I'm not sure how many more Conservative mayors we will.
But as you say, he doesn't have that much power. Well, I mean, maybe some people will remember the film Passport to Pimlico, where a small area of South London became independent. Would London get its own foreign policy? Because obviously London was against wars. Would London get its own?
No. We're talking. We're not talking
well, it's
about
money.
We're not talking about some sort of. We're not talking about declaration of independence or city-state at all. I mean, London is part of England and Britain, and I think that's part of its identity, and it will remain like that, forever. There's no question of that. It's just about. I'm afraid it's a rather sort of modest set of proposals. I mean, they seem radical by British standards, but by international standards, they're not radical at all.
Ben Rogers, thank you. Coming up after the break, should we be combating racism in Britain or classism? And Camp Bastion has lowered the British flag for the last time. We ask, what can we learn from mistakes made in Afghanistan? All this and more in part 2 of Going Underground. Today, David Cameron meets with the Emir of Qatar at number 10. It is Sheikh Tamim's first official visit to the UK since becoming ruler of the energy-rich country that owns swathes of Britain's priciest real estate. The meeting expected to focus on trade and investment issues, as well as military relations between London and Doha as the war against ISIS rages in Syria and Iraq. We can only wonder if the Sheikh, whose country became the first ever commercial partner of our Queen at Ascot this year, will demand an end to British boycotting of the Qatari-owned London department store Harrods. He has leverage, what with the Qatar Sovereign Wealth Fund QIA investing at least £10 billion in Britain in the past couple of years. Qatar owns the Shard, the Olympic Village, huge amounts of Canary Wharf, the world's most expensive block of flats which overlook Hyde Park, let alone 20% of the London Stock Exchange. But will Cameron reiterate something US Vice President Joe Biden said recently before making hasty apologies?
Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria.
His critical comments about Turkey, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar came during a recent speech at Harvard.
They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world.
So he's meeting with someone who the US Vice President has alleged is bankrolling British militants in the region, maybe even tabloid Salafist Jihadi John and his gruesome beheading videos. What to do? Insult the richest country in the world or back our servicemen and women flying warplanes over Iraq? Maybe he'll just settle for congratulating Sheikh Tamim on winning the bid to host the World Cup in 2022, even if Washington's heat on Qatar for backing ISIS is now stronger than the 50 degrees centigrade football players may have to endure during the championships. Defense Secretary Michael Fallon, in between apologizing for insulting immigrants, has admitted that mistakes were made in the war in Afghanistan. With me is veteran of the Afghanistan war, Joe Glenton, author of Soldier Box, Why I Won't Return to the War on Terror. Welcome back, Joe, to Going Underground. You were with the Royal Logistical Corps. Do you think we're getting an adequate picture of the withdrawal from Afghanistan?
The generals and the politicians between them have done a very good job from distracting from the reasons why we went and talking about how the conflict was badly mismanaged, which of course it was.
And pundits on state media continually harking back to that, saying basically the reason why it didn't work out well was we didn't have better radios, or, well, I'm exaggerating. It was a funding problem, which is why it's such a disastrous mess after British troops were in Afghanistan.
Sure it is, and there's a lot of talk about helicopters and not enough guns. This is the PR spin to distract from the fact that the war was misconceived from early on. And the reasons we went to war were wrong. We went to war, and we should be very clear about this, because there was a perception among British generals and politicians that we had failed in Americanising Basra, and we needed to catch up. And this was to impress the Americans. This was about hubris, not practical strategic needs.
And David Cameron, though, said that the reason was nothing to do with impressing the Americans. It was domestic security here in Britain.
Yeah, he does say that, and it's another one of those arguments which is wheeled out all the time. But of course, we now know we're less safe. We're less safe. We've seen attacks in this country inspired by, which came after the interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq. And the most obvious example of that is Woolwich. So
there was an increase then in attacks since we went into Afghanistan. Sure. He seems to suggest the main objective was security, domestic security. When you were out there in Afghanistan, were you and other troops, did you all feel that the reason you were in Afghanistan was to save Britain?
The rationale for us being in Afghanistan changed constantly, even up to the last minute, and even actually while we were there. 1 minute it was helping little brown girls go to school, and then it was cutting the poppy crop down, and then it was development and infrastructure rebuilding, and of course keeping our streets safe was mentioned, but the rationale just shifted constantly.
There seems to be footage of soldiers helping the opium crop now on the internet.
Well, there was a point when we actually had to, because so many of the local warlords are involved in opium production, where there was actually a deal cut to allow them to do that. And so that's the real story behind Afghanistan and the opium angle.
Now, Camp Bastion itself was known as Britain's Guantanamo for a period, forgotten about by state-funded broadcasters here. Why? Why did it earn that name?
Well, quite a lot of prisoners were held there unofficially for a long time, and it eventually emerged through a leak, I recall, and those prisoners were always supposed to be being handed back to the Afghan security forces, but of course that doesn't guarantee their conditions would be any better.
And yet there was no mention of it. So we had a sort of Guantanamo Bay going on, and there's the Union flag coming down in a kind of heroic way.
Yeah, well, the prisoners were kept there for an extended period of time, but of course this is another thing that's kind of been airbrushed out, and we're now seeing the war rebranded, particularly around this time of the year with all the poppies, out as a kind of flawed but heroic endeavour, and the British Guantanamo doesn't square with that, and so of course it has no function in the narrative.
And given that you were actually there, what does it feel like to watch people with poppies commemorating not only obviously the First World War, but there is this idea connecting the First World War, Second World War to Camp Bastion and the withdrawal?
Sure, I find it all very cynical. I don't wear a poppy. I don't have a huge problem with people who do, but the red poppy to me is a symbol increasingly of jingoism. We see Diamante-studded poppies on X Factor. It's been completely hijacked in my view. And this time is to remember the sacrifice, not just of British soldiers, of course. Absent from that narrative is all the other people on the other side who died in the 2 world wars, and of course all the Afghans who died.
And no one was counting the Afghans. Was there any feeling when you were out there that people should have been counting the number of Afghan civilians, let alone combatants, that were being killed because of our presence?
Not when I was there. I mean, I'm sure it popped into our minds at various times that we didn't know how many people were being killed. But of course, when you're in a war, you're absolutely focused on surviving and doing your job as well as you can, and you don't have time to consider the politics.
Now, Cameron says that there will be aid money going there. There are 500 soldiers in Kabul. Over here, there are, of course, veterans. Why is it veterans have to rely on charities rather than government funding for ailments that they've got since being there?
Sure. Well, I think part of the most obvious example of that is Help for Heroes, and it's an opportunity to. All big charities now are run as big companies, and it's an opportunity to neoliberalise, if you like, aftercare for soldiers, and also package it in this Help for Heroes in this very jingoistic way. And I think that's a key part of what's happening in Britain economically.
But there doesn't seem to be any signs for any of the political parties that there should be adequate funding for convalescence. And I know that you've talked about PTSD, people returning from theatre.
Yeah. Well, it's a strange one. They occasionally make noises about PTSD, but when there's a war on, the soldier and his wounds and his death and his injuries have a certain amount of political capital. When the war's over, that fades. In fact, aftercare for soldiers hits its peak in terms of cost about 40 years after a conflict. But by that time, it will have gone quiet and probably will have moved on to the next war. So it's Tommy Atkins again. Tommy Atkins is useful for a while, and everyone wants to be his friend when there's an election next year.
Tommy Atkins?
He's soon forgotten. Tommy Atkins is the mythical embodiment, personification of the British soldier.
Well, now we are facing some calls, or the government is facing some calls for an inquiry. What do you think about having an inquiry into the war in Afghanistan? The good war, I think you've called it before, the good war, as it were.
Yeah, well, I was quoting the other side, particularly Obama on Afghanistan being the good war. And of course, there should be an inquiry, but on current form, looking at the inquiries which have happened in this country around dodgy Middle Eastern and Central Asian wars, we're not going, it's not going to go very far. Though, it should be done. Will it be even-handed is the question. I don't think it will, going off Chilcot.
Joe Glanton, thank you. The Home Office just released new stats that show 44,000 hate crimes were recorded in England and Wales over the year to March. Is racism on the rise in the UK, or is race hate being used to mask underlying problems of inequality and austerity in our country? With us is Adrian Hart, filmmaker and author of the book That's Racist. Welcome, Adrian, to Going Underground. Is it wise? I mean, let's begin with, you felt the necessity to write a book about anti-racism and the fact that there's less racism now than in the 1980s.
Well, I mean, it needed to be said because as racism recedes, and that's been something very obvious to me over my life, anti-racism, or official anti-racism, as I often call it, has increased.
Let's get on then to the Macpherson report after the murder of Stephen Lawrence, how the establishment treated it. You seem to be drawing our attention to the fact that somehow the white working class are edged out of victimhood in favor of those who have color. Is that right? Or?
Well, I mean, I think it was the Macpherson inquiry itself that obviously focused on and brought into being its own concept of institutional racism, which was very much a colour-coded notion of the sufferings of black and minority ethnic citizens in this country. And somewhere in the
Because
mix...
you're against this idea of... I mean, many people applauded the head of the Metropolitan Police, the head of the BBC, big institutions, saying there was institutional racism. You don't like the term?
No, I don't. I mean, leaving aside the fact that Macpherson never suggested that the police were racist, he went on to expand the notion of institutional racism to society in general. He called it a social disease. In a way, it was a sort of get out of jail card for the police, because the police were able to say from the top, we're not racist, it's just those workers that turn up and put on uniforms, which is why institutional racism was a definition of racism that was really saying it's unconscious and it's unwitting and it's a social disease that is endemic across the white population.
So you've worked in communities for years on these sorts of subjects. When it comes to our schools, which you particularly focus on in this book, it's not Stokely Carmichaels that are checking through the forms to witness and to record racist attacks in school playgrounds?
Well, this has been forced on teachers, hasn't it? Because there were local authorities across the land that were saying to schools that you must record racist incidents, and you must use the Macpherson recommended definition of an incident as any incident perceived to be racist by the victim or any other person. And they were saying quite clearly across all the local authorities that a good school is a school that is recording an optimum number of incidents.
It's again this idea of targets in a way, is it?
Well, there weren't specific targets. It was just simply one of the signifiers of institutional racism, according to the Macpherson mindset, is to ignore something. And so teachers took the definition and they thought, right, we better play safe here. We better scour the playground, look out for any kind of name calling or...
Which most people would think of as kind of good, surely.
It's good all the way up to the point that it gets kind of labelled racism. The moment that you've got your local town hall leaning on you to elevate something out of that messy place of the playground, because they are kids, they are going to insult each other, and then elevate that to a racist incident.
Okay, you can see why that already will ring alarm bells amongst the liberal elite. You don't mention Islamophobia much in the book. How does Islamophobia, as seen by many to be increasing there, certainly on the rise according to some sections of the country?
Well, I mean, I did a freedom of information survey of all the local authorities, and I've done a spot check recently. And what I'm looking at on the racist incident forms is everything going on all the time. So you've got something you could call Islamophobia, you've got something that you could call race, but then you've also got Bangladeshi kids calling other Bangladeshi kids black monkey.
There's a whole process of recording.
It's a complete mess. It's now Ofsted who is saying, like, let me see your registers. You know, if we're going to rate you, we want to see whether you are fulfilling your obligations in terms of the Equalities Act. And so, you know, you look at this data, I look at this data, and I just think all it really proves is that kids from any ethnicity can be nasty little sods. Big surprise.
Adrian, thank you.
Pleasure.
Show's over for today, but watch out for us on Saturday when former London Mayor Ken Livingstone talks about mission creep as British bombs continue to rain down on Iraq. Don't forget, you can drop us a line on Twitter at underground_RT, like our page on Facebook, or email us on goingunderground@rttv.co.uk. See you on Saturday.